Hello. Whoa. How do I sound? That seems a little bit loud. How about now? How's that sound? Good sound? Yes? Maybe? Too loud? Too quiet? All right, excellent. I got a fancy new what's it for my microphone, and I forgot that I had gotten that between the last time I streamed and this one. So anyway, thank you all for being here. A happy Women's History Month. Um, More than halfway through the month, I am finally actually getting to a talk about women. So sorry. I apologize. I needed a break last week, but I'm really excited to talk about Æthelflæd, Lady of Mercia, tonight. I had initially intended this to be a longer, better lecture about Anglo-Saxon women in general. There are several um, who are awesome, but I ended up needing to talk the whole time about Æthelflæd. So I hope that you will be interested. I think you will, but I have a lot of cool things to say, and hopefully these 2 weeks of women will make up for. Will be good enough to make up for missing a week. Um, but really, friends, isn't every month Women's History Month? Respect women. Okay, let's talk about the Anglo-Saxons. So, first, I want to tell you that I have done my very best when it comes to pronunciation and to getting all of these names and places right, but Old English is not my forte. Um, Really, just regular English is barely my forte, so I'll do my best when it comes to pronunciation, but bear with me. And this is a really interesting time period, and there's a lot that goes on, but sources are extremely limited and often untrustworthy. And so I actually have a lot of fun things to say about that later, but be aware that I'm doing my best with limited information. And a lot of people have written about this, and a lot of people have had a lot to say about this time period, but much of it is speculative based on an archaeological or fragmentary evidence or various combinations of sources. And so we're all going to do our best. So, as you all no doubt know, in the 5th century, sometime around 410, the Romans, given that their empire was rapidly collapsing and being overrun by barbarians, withdrew from Britain, from the island of Great Britain, from what is now the UK, leaving it to the savages, the Britons who live there. And almost immediately after this, a period of migration began. This is called the Wolkerwanderung, the migration period. And by the 5th century, large numbers of mostly Germanic settlers had moved to the British Isles and displaced or integrated with the native Britons, who were a Celtic people. The Britons, as they existed before, were kind of pushed to Cornwall, Wales, up into Scotland, the Strathclyde area, which is now also Scotland, or to Ireland, and were displaced by groups of people known as Angles or Saxons, or together, the Anglo-Saxons. The word Anglo-Saxon comes from the Latin Angli-Saxones, and became the name of the peoples that the Benedictine monk and chronicle Bede called Angli. Another monk, Gildas the Wise, called them Saxones. It's likely that these people, especially at the beginning, called themselves Angli or Sax, or even more likely by one of their tribal names, something like Mercia, Gewissa, West Sax, or Northumbria. The terms English, which refers to the language English, and Anglicen, the people, was also used by the later West Saxon king to refer to sort of the whole group, and this was relatively common. But these people did not think of themselves as English. This was not a idea in their minds. They considered themselves, at best, Angles or Saxons, but more likely as part of their individual tribe or people group name. You've also probably heard similar words that have roots related to this. Saeson, actually don't know, is modern Welsh for English person, and of course Sassenach, which is Scottish Gaelic, and what Jamie Fraser calls Claire Randall in the sexy and exciting television show Outlander, which is also a book series. I won't recommend or not recommend it. It is quite exciting. It's a pretty good historically. I don't know. Use your best judgment. Okay, so with that in mind, by the I recommend that you maybe read and watch the first book, and even then, there's a really gratuitous sex, rape, torture scene at the end that I honestly can't recommend. So buyer be caveat emptor, I suppose. A lot of people like it. So by the end of the 5th century, a great deal of England had been populated by these Angles, these Saxons, and a new period, the Anglo-Saxon period, has begun in England. Hold on just a moment while I find my slideshow button. Okay, so a real quick word about names. So most of the Old English names of this time period are composites. And you're going to hear a lot of the same names. I'm sorry about that. There's a lot of Ethelwalds. There's a lot of Ethelreds, a lot of Alfreds, a lot of Edwards. So to understand this, know that the Ethel prefix means noble. Another common prefix is elf, which means elf, as you might have guessed. Ed, as in Edred or Edgard or Edwin, means blessed. And it's the original prefix of names like Edward, like I said, Edwin and Edgard. Of course, the suffixes have meanings. So Ethelwine, the wine means friend. So Ethelwine translates as noble friend. The protagonist of our story, Æthelflæd, means noble beauty. Æthelstan, who would ultimately unite England, means noble stone. Here's if I may be permitted, a little sidetrack into a bit of historical trivia. You may have heard of the person Ethelred the Unready, a later king, not actually part of our story today, but this is actually not because he was particularly bad as a king, though he was caught unaware by a great number of Danes. It actually is one of history's best and earliest puns. Red, or raid, means council. So Ethelred means a noble council, or council by nobles. Unread means badly or ill-counseled. So Ethelred Unread means noble counsel, the ill-counseled. Ethelred the Unready. It's a funny joke. Funny historian joke for you all. I hope you enjoyed that. Okay, so bear that in mind as we continue, and I say a lot of names that begin with Ethel. So, in the 6th, 7th, 8th century, England is divided into as many as 7 different kingdoms. This time period is sometimes called the Heptarchy, but really there are 4 main kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex. These are the biggest and most powerful kingdoms. Mercia, as you can see, sort of occupies central England. Northumbria is up in the north, as you might imagine. Wessex is Wessex. Sussex is Sussex. And East Anglia is the eastern and center part of England. These all sort of traded power and related to each other, and were sometimes intermarried or sometimes at war with each other. But for most of the 500s, 600s, 700s were relatively independent. Yes, Karate Chop Whiskey has jumped ahead to something I was going to say. Everything I'm going to tell you is in The Last Kingdom, which is a great show and you should watch. I'm going to get a little bit ahead of where the season is now, but feel free to after we're done here, watch The Last Kingdom, which is a great show and does come recommended by me. It's based off of a series of books by Bernard Cornwell, who is my favorite historical fiction writer. Anyway, you don't really need to know any of these names, except for Mercia and Wessex. Wessex and Mercia are generally the most powerful of the kingdoms. Mercia, specifically, comes from a Latinization of the Old English Merce, or Merce, meaning border people, from the Old English word Mirk, which has a similar origin to the word march. So, a march was, during the medieval period, a borderland that was specifically designed to protect against invasion. So, border people. So the kingdom of Mercia reached its height under Offa, who ruled in the 8th century, and Offa was a Christian king, which was not always the case, though increasingly the kings of England were Christians. He controlled much of the center of England, and he's best remembered probably for building a massive dike to keep the Welsh out, who were constantly causing problems. You can still go and see Offa's dike in the west of England if you like. It divided Mercia from Wales, where all of the Welsh lived. And Offa ruled over, one of the largest expanses of England and the greatest extent of Mercia. But one thing happened during Offa's reign that didn't impact his kingdom all that much, but would have significant impacts down the line. And this is from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which reads, AD 787. This year King Bertric took Edburga, the daughter of Offa, to wife, and in his days came first 3 ships of the Northmen from the land of robbers. The reeve then rode thereto, and would drive them to the king's town. For he knew not what they were, and there was he slain. These were the first ships of the Danish men that sought the land of the English nation. Oh. God damn it. Get back here. This was the sacking of the Lindisfarne Priory, a monastery on the northeastern coast of England, which you can see here, by Vikings, by Danes. This is probably, not for sure, but probably the first Viking raid on England. The one referred to I just talked about was not this, and then later Lindisfarne was sacked, which is much more famous, 1793. Which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records as, in this year, foreboding omens came over the land of the Northumbrians, and the wretched people shook. There were excessive whirlwinds, lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. These signs were followed by great famine, and a little after those, that same year, on the 6th Ides of January, the ravaging of wretched heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. The Vikings came. They sacked the priory, they killed a bunch of monks, they took them hostage and made them slaves, they took all their shiny gold objects, and apparently it was so successful that the Vikings kept doing it. They kept coming year after year after year, raiding the English coasts, though they did not make any attempt to settle or to really make any permanent relocation into England until 1865, when, according to legend, the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, the legendary Norwegian Swedish king, landed in England, leading what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the Great Heathen Army. And they would eventually occupy East Anglia, Northumbria, Mercia, parts of Scotland, and much of Ireland. There was an ongoing invasion by Danish and then later Norwegian Vikings that would occupy huge portions of the British Isles. So, very briefly, there's way too much to say about the Danes and about Vikings at this point in time, but they're pretty important to this narrative, so I just want to touch on a few things. Viking is not a people group or a nation or an ethnicity. It is a job. A Viking is, you go a Viking. You are, it is generally actually refers to a trading expedition, not necessarily a raid, though it would depend on who was recording this or who you asked. And these Vikings came from Denmark, they came from Norway, they came from Sweden, they came from elsewhere. And most of the ones we're going to deal with tonight are Danish, but not exclusively. And they were all under various warlords, and they all had distinct identities and motivations. Vikings in general were more interested in trading and in exploring than they were in violence and raids. It varies, it depends. That being said, the Vikings who ended up on English shores were almost all men, and they were absolutely interested in doing violence to the English. Eventually, a lot of them would settle down and take land, but initially they were armed, they were war bands, and they were there to plunder, raid, and kill Christians. So, what are the Anglo-Saxons to do? Well, these are the Danes, in their longboats coming to plunder England. Well, in 849, the youngest son of King Æthelwulf was born, named Alfred. And Æthelwulf died when Alfred was very young. 3 of Alfred's brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred, reigned before him. They all died, and the last, I believe, died in battle with the Danes. Alfred ascended to the throne of Wessex in 871 and spent basically the rest of his life fighting the Danes. He won some victories at first, but in 878, the Danes attacked Kippenham, which is now Chippenham, where Alfred was wintering, and he was forced to flee into the marshes of Somerset. This is considered basically the low point of Anglo-Saxon history, and this is when Wessex was the last kingdom of which the show gets its name. However, Alfred survived being driven into the swamps of Somerset. He rallied his men at Egbert's Stone and led them to battle at Ethandun, where he defeated the Viking warlord Guthrum and his army, chased them back to Chippenham, where he forced a surrender. Guthrum converted to Christianity and submitted to Alfred, retreating to East Anglia. Now, this became known as the Danelaw region, where Christian or Christian-aligned Danish kings would rule over portions of England, often in alliance, but increasingly in conflict with Alfred and his successors. Importantly, in 886, Alfred restored the Mercian... Excuse me, give me a sec. Excuse me. In 886, Alfred restored the Mercian town of London and claimed the title of King of the Anglo-Saxons. So sometimes when you look at the history of England, people will point to Alfred as the first king of England. This is both true and not true. This is basically, you can say whatever you want. It depends on whether or not you can prove it. Truthfully, it wasn't until his nephew, Æthelstan, basically united all of the kingdoms in 927 that really there was an England. But Alfred claimed the title of King of Anglo-Saxons and was allowed to keep it. And this is really interesting because the reason why we know so much about Alfred and the reason why he now has such a prominent place in English history is because Alfred, specifically one of his monks, Asser, wrote the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, or restored it, or basically put a lot of effort into chronicling what happened. Yes, Gerlax is right. He was a huge nerd. He was a very learned man, and he wanted his kids to be learned, and he wanted all the people of England to be learned. He was also a insufferable, tedious, unpleasant Christian who did not like fun. But he was a very good king as far as these things are concerned. And because Alfred had so much control over his own narrative, he became incredibly important in the history of England. The truth is that lots of people were actually writing history at this time, and we'll talk about some of those other histories when we get to Æthelflæd, but Alfred did such a good job of restoring and organizing and keeping those records intact that he became really critical to English history. He basically posted his way into being, one of the most important kings of England. He also had 5, maybe 6 children, unclear. The eldest of which was probably Æthelflæd, though actually her birthday is not recorded. It also included Edward, future King of Wessex, and a bunch of other kids that I'm not going to mention. At this time, there was no king of Mercia. There was, however, a lord of the Mercia. So independent Mercia had disappeared with Ceolwulf II, who had died fighting the Vikings sometime in the late 870s. It's hard to tell from the records. West Mercia was left to the Mercians, and the east became part of the Danelaw. Sometime around 880, a man named Ethelred became Lord of Mercia, not king, and ultimately submitted to Alfred. From this time onward, Mercia is essentially a client kingdom or a vassal of Wessex. He married Æthelflæd sometime in probably around 886, again, around the restoration of London. Ethelred and Edward would continue to fight the Danes throughout the 890s, but when Alfred died in 899, there was a struggle for his throne. Edward defeated the pretender Ethelwold, who was, he was Alfred's cousin? He was his nephew. Sorry. Ethelwold was Edward's cousin, Alfred's nephew, the son of one of Alfred's brothers who had died. Anyway, Ethelwold gathered a bunch of Danes together and raised an army and ultimately got his ass kicked. Technically, the battle they fought ended in a loss for Wessex, but Ethelwold died, so it was fine. The strength of his rule, however, was threatened by this. The battle didn't go well. He technically lost it, and the Mercians fought with Edward, certainly including Ethelred and likely Æthelflæd. So Edward the Elder, as he is called, by all accounts, a perfectly fine, good king. He did a lot of work continuing Alfred's efforts of uniting England under English rule. But there's a lot of question marks that we'll get into later. Ethelred and Æthelflæd, so if you have watched The Last Kingdom, he is portrayed in a certain way, but Ethelred was much older than Æthelflæd was, probably 20 years at least, if not more. And from the records that we can tell, and again, the records don't really talk about this, but they seem to have a perfectly amiable relationship. They christened a bunch of cathedrals together. They sent some relics to Rome. They did whatever people do, whatever kings and queens do. It is not clear that Æthelflæd and Ethelred had anything but a perfectly normal relationship. They may have even been a Anglo-Saxon power couple. Yes, sorry. Æthelflæd is Alfred's daughter. Ethelwold died at the Battle of... God, I actually didn't write down the name of the battle. Whatever it was, where... wherever Ethelwold died. Last Kingdom is pretty accurate. The thing is, the Last Kingdom, if we're going to talk about this, what's great about this time period is there's just like a handful of significant events in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and it adheres to all of those, and it takes a lot of liberties where things are not written down. So Ubba, the bad guy, I guess, in the first season, it was a real historical figure, and it's not recorded who kills him. So in The Last Kingdom, it's Uhtred, the fictional Lord of Bebbanburg, who kills him, which, as far as anyone knows, might as well be true because we don't know who killed Ubba. We also don't know who killed Ethelwold, and I believe it's also Uhtred in The Last Kingdom. And, hey, you're already being spoiled. I'm sorry. You're going to find out what happens. Anyway, so the Mercians fought with Edward, and Ethelred and Æthelflæd seemed to get along just fine. It's hard to tell. And they ruled together for a handful of years, actually for about a decade, or they ruled under Æthelflæd, or Ethelred. God, I'm going to start getting this wrong. But Ethelred's health began to decline sometime after Alfred's death. And it seems that Æthelflæd was probably the de facto ruler of Mercia by around 902. The chronicles suggest that she was making decisions on her own and leading armies, or at least expeditions, on her own. And around this time, Norse Viking were expelled from Dyfflin, which is now Dublin, and asked permission to settle near Caister, which is Chester. Later, they would betray Æthelflæd, joining with Danish Vikings to attack Caister. Apparently, Æthelflæd managed to convince the Irish to switch sides and fortified Caister, repelling the Danes. Now, according to the Annals of Ireland, which is one of the other sources that we have about Æthelflæd's life, this is what it has to say about her during this time period. Although they held that council secretly, the queen learned of it. The queen then gathered a large army about her from the adjoining regions and filled the city of Chester with her troops, and repelled the Danish and Norwegian invaders. Now, it is recorded that it's not clear what happened to Ethelred, what type of injury or sickness he had, but it's pretty clear that he was out of commission for the rest of his life. And in 911, he dies, and Æthelflæd becomes Mirkna Hledi, or Lady of Mercia. One historian describes this as one of the most unique events in early medieval history. And this is unique and is interesting. There had been one Anglo-Saxon queen who I didn't write down. Sorry, I forgot her name. But she only ruled for a year or two, and one of the only things that is written about her is that men would not follow her into battle. But there really was not a lot of precedent for this. Women were forbidden from playing any sort of political role in Wessex, but Mercian queens had more power, especially some of the previous queens had been involved in a lot more decision-making. And so it seems that when Ethelred died, everyone just accepted that Æthelflæd was going to lead the country, or lead the kingdom, and they were perfectly happy to follow her both as a leader, as a strategist, and as a war leader. And one of her first projects was extending the network of fortified towns, burhs, that had begun under Alfred. Absolutely. Hashtag girlboss. This is the Roman town, which had been built where Chester is now. And in a lot of places, Æthelflæd, following in Alfred's footsteps, began to repair these walls and restore these fortified towns. Chester is one of her greatest successes. And this was really interesting because Alfred's campaign was basically a system of defense meant to protect this territory from Danish incursions. And it was continued by Æthelflæd and by her brother Edward. His boroughs, according to him, or a later document, were designed to be permanent settlements of both people and fortresses for his semi-permanent garrison. So the idea was to build these fortified towns that could be mustered, or at least harry the Danes as they tried to, go through raiding. Because what would happen throughout the Viking period is they would gather an army, rampage through the countryside, steal and pillage and whatever, and then either fight where they wanted to fight or not fight at all. And so these boroughs would become both a tool for conquest, right, holding on to territory and consolidating that territory after it had been taken. And even after Alfred's death, as the conquest of the Danelaw began, Edward and Ethelred and Æthelflæd began building more and more and more of these. And Æthelflæd's greatest sort of like existing legacy is these towns like Chester, Gloucestershire, Worcester, and a few others were basically built and defended and fortified by Æthelflæd during her life. But I know you're all wondering, the question that is on your minds, the thing that we all want to know is, was Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians, a warrior queen? Did she, as we see in this picture here, lead her troops into battle? And this is a good question. And there's some disagreement on this, but one thing is absolutely clear, is that she led armies and expeditions herself. She gathered men, got them together, and led them to where they would fight. She was, if nothing else, absolutely a strategist and war leader who was respected by her men. She was also ruthless. In 1916, a Mercian abbot was killed while in Welsh territory. 3 days later, Æthelflæd sent an army into Wales, where she destroyed Brecamnamir, Welsh, and took 34 hostages, including a Welsh king's wife. And she spent the 19-teens repelling Viking attacks, but around 1917, Æthelflæd went on the offensive and recaptured Derby, which was the first blow in an ongoing campaign to reconquer the Danelaw. In 1918, she took Leicester without resistance, and most of the Danes submitted to her. Shortly afterwards, the Danes of Efferwich, York, pledged allegiance to her, but she died in 1918 before she could seize the opportunity. Accordingly, she may have also forged an alliance with the Scots and the Britons of Strathclyde. So this is a bit from the Irish, the three fragments from the Irish annals that write about Æthelflæd. And they say, "Now Otyr, the most greatly esteemed earl in this battle, when he saw the Saxons slaughtering his people, fled into a dense wood near him, along with those of his people who survived. A huge throng of Saxons came after him, and they surrounded the wood. The queen commanded them to hack down all the forest with their swords and battle axes, and they did so. First they felled the trees, and then all the pagans who were in the wood were killed. The pagans were slaughtered by the queen like that, and so that her fame spread in all directions. Æthelflæd, through her own cleverness, made peace with the men of Alba and with the Britons, so that whenever the same race should come to attack her, they would rise to help her. If it were against them that they came, she would take arms with them. While this continued, the men of Alba and Britain overcame the settlements of the Norwegians and destroyed and sacked them." So, I'll talk about the different source material in my next slide, which is, surprise, I have tricked you into listening to me talk about historiography. But the Anglo-Saxon chronicles are pretty dry about Æthelflæd, but all of the other source material that exists suggests that not only was she actively engaged in war making, but she may have very well fought in battles herself. It was common for Anglo-Saxon kings to fight on the front lines, and Æthelflæd may very well have done so. She, if nothing else, was at many of the battles that she commanded men to fight in. Now, she was succeeded after her death by her daughter Elfwin, which is really, really interesting to me. Unfortunately, Edward deposed Elfwin after a matter of months and took control of Mercia. Elfwin most likely spent the rest of her life as a nun, and there was great resentment in Mercia about this. Now, it does seem likely that there is an element of sibling rivalry and possibly just straight-up misogyny about this. I would like to suggest, though, that there was also an element of nationalism in this, largely that perhaps Edward did not want an independent Mercia, and that it was easier and better for him to bring the kingdom under his control by deposing Elfwin. More on that in a sec. So what do we know? So how do we know about Ethelred? What do we know about her, right? And this is what's really, really interesting. And this is, I think, what makes both Alfred and his successors so fascinating from a historical perspective. So there are a handful of sources that we know about Æthelflæd from. Officially, the main history of England around this time period is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which has a handful of different sources, different versions of it, A, B, C, D, and E. Don't worry too much about that. Some of them are canonical, and some of them are not, but they all record most of the same information. The official Anglo-Saxon Chronicle includes almost nothing about Æthelflæd. It basically lists her as the wife of Ethelred and the sister of Edward, daughter of Alfred, and almost nothing more. And one historian describes this as a conspiracy of silence, the way that she has been really written out of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Now, it does not seem actually that when they were alive that there was any animosity between her and Edward. In fact, they worked really well together when they were reconquering the Danelaw. And he did seize some land from Mercia, but he was king of the Anglo-Saxons and was allowed to do so. It is possible that was not recorded in in any history anywhere, but it seems just as likely that those responsible for writing her out of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle were possibly later Wessex noblemen or church leaders who found both her strength as a woman and her Mercian roots kind of inconvenient. Other versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle include the Mercian Register, which is a history of Mercia, and has a much fuller and more enthusiastic account of Æthelflæd's life. The Annals of Ireland, which I have just read pieces from, especially that of Ulster, call her queen. They credit her with great military successes. They depict her as a warrior queen and a fighter. And there's some evidence, possibly from Irish oral histories, that also she was perceived that way and that she had a greater role in warfare. And this is, of course, so fascinating to me because regardless of the source material, given the time period, given everything that was working against her, Æthelflæd must have been a truly tremendous woman. Even to accomplish what she did, ruling for 7 years on her own, essentially keeping her kingdom together. She was, by all accounts, well loved by her people, respected, trusted. The patriarchal norms that became sort of like hard-coded in medieval culture were actually not all that solidly built at this time, but even so, it must have been tremendously difficult for any woman to hold any sort of power in this time period. And if nothing else, she must have been truly exceptionally charismatic, clever, and strategic in the way that she conducted herself. It is also entirely possible that she was a savage warrior queen and a murderer of pagans. She was, like every other English king or queen in this time period, an absolute ruthless, religious zealot who was trying their very darndest to drive all non-Christians out of England. So, not so great there. But very, very impressive from a historical point of view. And I wonder, especially given that, one of the more interesting sources of history about Æthelflæd is literally fragments from a lost chronicle. What are we missing? And this is, I think, why Æthelflæd is so interesting and why it's worth dwelling on her as a historian, because it's just one of those many wonderful, perfect examples of a tantalizing piece of a history that we don't know. And what we do know depicts a very interesting, powerful, impressive woman in a time when it was very difficult to be so. And this is, I think, instructive when learning about and talking about history, is that the people that we know about, the people that we talk about, the periods and events and ideas that are important are not the only ideas that are there, or not even necessarily the ones that are actually the most important. They are the ones that we have records of. And so I think that Æthelflæd is really interesting in that way, because you can see sort of the shape and the outline of what might be, but we have no way of knowing, because ultimately all we have to go off of is what was written down. So that's what I have to say about Æthelflæd, Lady of Mercia. Really interesting, fascinating queen of early England. If you enjoyed this at all, definitely check out the Last Kingdom show. It comes with my historian recommendation. It's good enough. The lead actor is indeed absolutely a babe. And it's a lot of fun. I think the Vikings show is about Ragnar Lodbrok. I think I watched the first season of that. I don't know if I can recommend it because I don't remember anything about it, but yeah, definitely check that out. And I will be back next week with, I forgot what I said I was going to talk about. What did I say I was going to talk about? Either suffragettes or revolutionary women. I'm not sure which one I have more material for, but I'll definitely be talking about that. Might try to squeeze in an extra talk next week. We'll see. That may be a little bit too ambitious, but we'll see what I can do. March is a longish month. And yeah, thank you for being here, everybody. Thank you for listening. Happy Friday. Get vaccinated. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you all next time.